Commander Zeth Var stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Council Station, his four arms crossed in obvious displeasure. The Kytherian war hero had survived 3 major conflicts, commanded fleets that numbered in the thousands, and earned decorations from 7 different species. Yet here he was, being told that a species barely out of their own solar system would be joining the war effort against the Devourers. Humans, he muttered under his breath, the word coming out like a curse. His translator barely caught the disdain in his voice as he watched the primitive vessels approach the station. The ships looked like metal coffins welded together by children, lacking the elegant curves of Altarian vessels or the geometric precision of Zephyrian craft. They were ugly, utilitarian things that shouldn't have been able to survive the journey through hyperspace. Commander, his aide, Lieutenant Vexen, approached cautiously. The human delegation has requested a meeting with you specifically. They've heard of your reputation. Zethvar's mandibles clicked in annoyance. My reputation? What could these primitives possibly know about warfare? They've never faced an enemy that could eat planets. The Devourers had appeared at the galaxy's edge 5 years ago, consuming everything in their path. Entire star systems had vanished, leaving nothing but empty space where thriving worlds once existed. The greatest military minds of the galaxy had thrown everything they had at these creatures and barely managed to slow their advance. Now, in desperation, the Council was accepting help from anyone willing to fight. Sir, the humans claim to have strategies that might be effective against the Devourers. They've been studying our combat reports and believe they've identified weaknesses we've overlooked. Zethvar turned away from the viewport, his expression darkening. Strategies? From a species that's never fought anything more dangerous than themselves? Lieutenant, I've spent my entire life perfecting the art of war. I've studied under the greatest tactical minds in galactic history. The idea that some backwater species could teach me anything about combat is insulting. The commander made his way through the station's corridors, his heavy footsteps echoing off the metallic walls. Other species gave him respectful nods as he passed. The Altarians, with their crystalline skin, shimmered in acknowledgement. The gaseous nebulans formed brief patterns of respect in the air. Even the proud Zephyrians inclined their heads slightly. Zethvar had earned this respect through blood and victory. When he entered the conference room, he was surprised to find only 3 humans waiting for him. He had expected a larger delegation, perhaps trying to compensate for their obvious inadequacy with numbers. The leader appeared to be a female with graying hair and calm eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Beside her sat a younger male covered in scars, and an elderly male whose hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with machinery. Commander Zethvar, the woman stood and extended her hand in the human greeting ritual. I'm Admiral Sarah Chun. This is Colonel Marcus Rivera and Chief Engineer Thomas Walsh. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. Zethvar looked at the extended hand for a moment before reluctantly touching it with one of his own. The grip was firm, perhaps firmer than he had expected. Admiral Chun, I admit I'm curious about what you believe you can contribute to this war effort. Admiral Chun gestured to the holographic display in the center of the table. We've been analyzing the Devourer attack patterns, and we've noticed something that seems to have been overlooked. They always attack the strongest positions first. Of course they do, Zethvar replied, settling his massive frame into the reinforced chair. They're predators. They eliminate the greatest threats before moving on to easier prey. This is basic military doctrine. But that's exactly the point. Colonel Rivera leaned forward, his scarred face intense. In every engagement, you've tried to meet strength with strength. You've put your best ships, your most experienced crews, your most advanced weapons at the front lines. And you've lost them. Zethvar's mandibles clicked sharply. Those crews died with honor, defending civilization itself. Their sacrifice bought time for evacuations and allowed weaker species to escape. And that's admirable, Admiral Chin said softly. But it's also exactly what the Devourers want. They're not just consuming matter and energy. They're learning from every engagement. Every time you throw your best at them, they adapt and become stronger. Chief Engineer Walsh activated a series of tactical displays. Look at these engagement reports. Each time you've used a new weapon or strategy, the Devourers have adapted to it within 3 encounters. They're not just hungry. They're intelligent. Zethvar studied the data, his trained mind immediately recognizing the patterns. It was true that devourer resistance to various weapons had increased over time, but he had attributed that to natural evolution under pressure. What are you suggesting? That we send our weakest ships to die first? That's not strategy, it's cowardice. No, Admiral Chen smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Zethvar's skin crawl. We're suggesting we give them something to choke on. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Zethvar had heard rumors about human history, about how they had nearly destroyed their own planet through warfare before achieving spaceflight. He had dismissed these stories as exaggeration, but now, looking at these three humans, he began to wonder if perhaps there was truth to the tales. Explain, he demanded. Colonel Rivera pulled up a new display, showing ship schematics that looked even more primitive than the vessel Zethvar had observed earlier. Commander, what do you know about human military history? Very little, Zethvar admitted. Your species has only been known to the galaxy for 30 years, and most of that time has been spent in diplomatic contact rather than military cooperation. Humans have been fighting wars for thousands of years, Admiral Chen said. We fought with sticks and stones, with swords and shields, with gunpowder and steel, with nuclear weapons and electronic warfare. We've fought each other, our environment, and everything else we've encountered. War isn't just something we do, Commander. It's something we are. Walsh brought up historical documents, translated into galactic standard. We've never had the luxury of technological superiority, Commander. We've always had to fight smarter, dirtier, and more viciously than our enemies. We've learned to turn our weaknesses into strengths, and our enemies' strengths into weaknesses. Zethvar reviewed the documents with growing disbelief. Wars that lasted decades, conflicts that consumed entire continents, weapons designed not just to destroy, but to terrorize and demoralize. The sheer scale of human violence was staggering, and yet they had somehow managed to unite their species and develop faster than light travel. This is barbarism, he said finally. Yes, Admiral Chen agreed, and it's exactly what the Devourers aren't expecting. Rivera activated another display, showing fleet compositions and battle plans. Every species in the galaxy has tried to fight the Devourers honorably, using established military doctrine and civilized rules of engagement. You've treated this like a war between equals. But the Devourers aren't equals, Commander. They're a force of nature, and you don't fight nature with honor. You fight it with everything you have. Zethvar stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I will not sacrifice the principles that separate us from the very monsters we're fighting. Military honor exists for a reason. And how well has honor served you so far? Admiral Chun asked quietly. How many worlds have been consumed while you maintained your principles? How many species have been reduced to refugee populations while you fought cleanly? The words hit Zethvar like physical blows. In 5 years of war, the Galactic Alliance had won exactly 0 major victories. They had managed a few tactical successes, brief delays in the Devourer advance, but nothing that had actually stopped or reversed their progress. Trillions of beings had died or been consumed, and the enemy seemed stronger than ever. What exactly are you proposing? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Admiral Chen stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the assembled fleet. We're proposing that you let us show the galaxy how humans fight. But I warn you, Commander, once you see what we're capable of, you'll never look at us the same way again. As Zethvar stared at the 3 humans, he realized that perhaps the galaxy's greatest threat wasn't the force that consumed worlds from the outside. Perhaps it was the species they had just invited to help them fight. 3 weeks later, Zethvar found himself aboard a human vessel called the Vindictive, a name that seemed entirely appropriate given what he had learned about human psychology. The ship's interior was cramped, utilitarian, and filled with the constant hum of machinery that seemed to be held together by willpower and spite. Everything about it offended his military sensibilities, from the exposed conduits running along the walls to the crew members who addressed their officers by their first names. Admiral on deck, someone called out as Sarah Chun entered the bridge, but the response was casual, almost dismissive compared to the rigid protocols Zethvar was accustomed to. The crew continued their work without the formal acknowledgments that would have been expected on any proper warship. Status report, Admiral Chun said, settling into a chair that looked like it had been salvaged from a transport vessel. "We're 3 hours out from the Kepler system," reported the navigation officer, a young woman whose hair was an alarming shade of blue. "Long-range sensors confirmed Devourer presence. Looks like they're about halfway through consuming the fourth planet." Zethvar's mandibles clicked in distress. The Kepler system had been home to 12 billion Altarians just 2 weeks ago. Now it was being systematically destroyed, and they were flying directly toward the creatures responsible. "Excellent," Admiral Chin said, and Zethvar was shocked by the satisfaction in her voice. "Mr. Walsh, are our special packages ready?" Chief Engineer Walsh looked up from his console, his weathered face breaking into what humans called grin. It was not a pleasant expression. "All 47 ships are loaded and ready, Admiral. The crews have been briefed on the mission parameters." Zethvar studied the tactical display, trying to understand what he was seeing. The human fleet consisted of 47 ships, but they weren't warships in any traditional sense. They were freighters, mining vessels, exploration craft, and what appeared to be decommissioned hospital ships. Many showed clear signs of battle damage that had been hastily repaired. "Admiral," Zethvar said carefully, "I understood that this was to be a demonstration of human military capabilities. This appears to be a collection of civilian vessels." Colonel Rivera, who had been silent until now, let out a sound that Zethvar's translator identified as laughter, though it held no humor. "Commander, you're still thinking like a civilized being. In human military history, the most effective weapons have often been the ones that looked harmless." Admiral Chun activated a new display showing the fleet composition in detail. "Commander Zethvar, I want you to understand something fundamental about human warfare. We don't have honor guards or ceremonial weapons. We don't have ships that are built for show. Every single vessel in this fleet has been converted into a weapon, and every crew member is ready to die to complete the mission." "Converted how?" Zethvar demanded. Walsh pulled up technical specifications that made the Kytherian commander's blood run cold. "Each ship is carrying approximately 50,000 tons of what we call aggressive nanomachines. They're designed to replicate using any available matter, but they're programmed with some very specific targeting parameters." "Nanomachines," Zethvar repeated slowly. "You mean like the Zephyrian medical nanites?" "Not exactly," Admiral Chin said. "Zephyrian nanites are designed to heal and repair. Human nanites are designed to consume and destroy. We've been developing them for exactly this kind of enemy." Rivera brought up combat footage from human history, showing weapons that Zethvar had never imagined. "Commander, humans have always specialized in asymmetric warfare. When the Spanish conquistadors landed in the Americas, they didn't defeat the Aztec Empire through superior numbers or technology alone. They used biological weapons, political manipulation, and psychological warfare. When tiny Britain controlled a quarter of the world, they didn't do it through fair fights." "You're talking about genocide," Zethvar said, his voice barely controlled. "Yes," Admiral Chin replied without hesitation. "We're talking about genocide, the complete and utter destruction of a species that threatens all life in the galaxy. Commander, your people have been fighting this war like it's a sporting contest with rules and referees. The Devourers don't follow rules. They don't take prisoners. They don't negotiate. They consume everything in their path, and they'll keep doing it until there's nothing left." The bridge fell silent except for the constant hum of machinery. Zethvar stared at the humans around him, realizing that he was seeing them clearly for the first time. These weren't the eager-to-please primitives he had expected. They were predators, apex killers who had somehow managed to survive on a planet that had tried to destroy them for millions of years. "The nanomachines," he said slowly. "What do they do exactly?" Walsh's expression became grim. "They're designed to target the specific cellular structure we've identified in Devourer samples. They'll ignore everything else and focus entirely on breaking down Devourer biomass at the molecular level. Once they're deployed, they'll spread throughout the enemy force, consuming it from within. And what about after they've destroyed the Devourers? They're programmed with a limited lifespan," Admiral Chin said. 72 hours after deployment, they'll break down completely. There won't be any trace left." Zethvar studied the technical specifications, his trained mind recognizing the elegance of the design. It was horrifying in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. "This isn't warfare," he said. "This is extermination." "Exactly," Rivera said. "Commander, you keep talking about honor and principles, but what honor is there in losing? What principle is served by allowing the Devourers to consume the galaxy? Sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is to be willing to do uncivilized things." The navigation officer called out, "Admiral, we're entering the Kepler system. Devourer forces detected on multiple vectors." Admiral Chen stood and moved to the central command position. "All ships, this is vindictive. Execute Operation Pandora. Remember, once those packages are deployed, we have exactly 72 hours to clear the system." Zethvar watched in fascination and horror as the human fleet scattered across the system. The vessels moved with purpose, but without the precise formations he was accustomed to seeing in military operations. They looked like frightened civilians fleeing a disaster, but he was beginning to understand that with humans, appearances were always deceiving. "Devourer forces are converging on our position," reported the tactical officer. "They're focusing on the largest ships first, just like in previous engagements." "Perfect," Admiral Chen said. "That's exactly what we want them to do." On the main display, Zethvar could see the Devourers approaching. They were massive, organic ships that seemed to flow through space like living creatures. Their hulls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, and their weapons were integrated seamlessly into their biology. They were beautiful in their own way and absolutely terrifying. The first human ship to be attacked was one of the converted freighters. The Devourers swarmed over it, their feeding tentacles penetrating the hull and beginning to consume the vessel from the inside out. Zethvar had seen this happen dozens of times before, but he had never watched it with quite the same level of attention. "Now," Admiral Chen said quietly. Walsh activated a control sequence, and suddenly, every human ship in the system began broadcasting the same signal. It was a simple radio transmission, but Zethvar recognized the pattern immediately. It was a detonation code. The freighter that was being consumed exploded, but not in the way Zethvar expected. Instead of a massive blast, there was a series of smaller explosions that spread throughout the ship's hull. The Devourers that had been feeding on it suddenly began writhing in apparent distress, their feeding tentacles retracting as if they had been burned. "Nanomachine deployment successful," Walsh reported. "Pattern Alpha is active and spreading." On the tactical display, Zethvar could see the effects spreading through the Devourer force. The creatures that had been in contact with the destroyed freighter began exhibiting signs of distress, and those signs quickly spread to other nearby Devourers. Whatever the humans had done, it was contagious. "How long until we see full effectiveness?" Admiral Chen asked. "Based on our models, approximately 6 hours for complete system saturation," Walsh replied. "The nanomachines need time to replicate and spread through the entire Devourer biomass." Rivera was monitoring communications from the other human ships. "All vessels report successful deployment. We're tracking 47 separate infection vectors throughout the system." Zethvar realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. For the first time since the war began, someone was actually fighting back against the Devourers in a way that might be effective. But the cost of that effectiveness was challenging everything he believed about civilized warfare. "Admiral," he said slowly, "what you just done, it's going to change everything." Sarah Chan turned to look at him, and her expression was sad but determined. "Commander, humans learned a long time ago that sometimes you have to become the monster to defeat the monster. We've crossed lines that can't be uncrossed, developed weapons that should never have been created, and done things that we'll never be able to forget. But we're still here, and we're still fighting." As they watched the Devourers begin to die in agony throughout the Kepler system, Zethvar realized that the galaxy had just gained a weapon more terrible than anything the Devourers possessed. And that weapon was humanity itself. 6 hours later, the Kepler system was silent. Where once a massive Devourer fleet had been systematically consuming the remains of a civilization, now there was only empty space and slowly dissipating clouds of organic matter. Zethvar stood on the bridge of the Vindictive, staring at the tactical display in a mixture of awe and revulsion. "Comprehensive scan complete," reported the human sensor operator. "No devourer life signs detected anywhere in the system. The nanomachines have broken down as programmed, and residual contamination is within acceptable parameters." Admiral Chen nodded grimly. "Transmit the all clear to the fleet. Begin evidence collection protocols." "Evidence collection?" Zethvar asked. Colonel Rivera looked up from his station, his scarred face unreadable. "We need to understand exactly how effective the nanomachines were, and whether the Devourers managed to transmit any information about what happened here before they died. If they warned other Devourer forces, we might have lost the element of surprise." Chief Engineer Walsh was already analyzing the data streaming in from the collection drones. "Initial readings are promising, Admiral. The nanomachines achieved 97% efficiency in biomass conversion. More importantly, the infection rate exceeded our projections by 40%. If we can deploy these weapons on a larger scale, we could end this war," Admiral Chen finished. "But first, we need to convince the Galactic Council that this is the right path forward." Zethvar felt a chill run down his spine. "You want to mass-produce these weapons? Do you have any idea what you're suggesting?" "Complete victory," Rivera said simply. "Commander, in human military history, wars end in one of two ways. Either both sides agree to stop fighting, or one side is completely destroyed. The Devourers have made it clear they're not interested in negotiation." The Kytherian commander studied the tactical data, his mind wrestling with the implications. In 6 hours, a single human fleet had accomplished what the combined forces of the galaxy had failed to do in 5 years. They had not just defeated a Devourer force. They had obliterated it so completely that no trace remained. "There will be consequences," he said slowly. "The Council species will never accept weapons like this. They'll see it as a violation of every principle of civilized warfare." Admiral Chun turned away from the display, her expression weary. "Commander, let me tell you something about human history that might help you understand our perspective. During our Second World War, we developed nuclear weapons. Bombs that could destroy entire cities in seconds. The decision to use them was agonizing, but it ended a conflict that might have continued for years and cost millions more lives." "And afterward?" Zethvar asked. "Afterward, we lived with the knowledge that we had crossed a line. We created weapons control treaties, established international law, and spent decades trying to ensure that such weapons would never be used again. But we also ensured that when someone threatened our species with extinction, we had the tools to respond." Walsh pulled up a new display showing projections of galactic Devourer movements. "Commander, based on our analysis, the Devourers will reach the core worlds within 18 months. They'll consume Earth, Kytheria, Altair Prime, and Zephyr Station. Every major population center in the galaxy will be gone. Unless we deploy the nanomachines on a systematic basis," Rivera added. "We've identified 43 systems currently under Devourer attack. If we can coordinate simultaneous strikes." "You're talking about genocide on a galactic scale," Zethvar interrupted. "Yes," Admiral Chen said. "We're talking about the complete extermination of a species that exists only to consume other species." "Commander, I know this challenges everything you believe about warfare and civilization, but sometimes survival requires us to do terrible things." The bridge fell silent as Zethvar processed what he was hearing. He thought about the wars he had fought, the enemies he had defeated with honor and dignity. He thought about the military traditions of his people, the codes of conduct that separated civilized beings from monsters. But he also thought about the trillions of beings who had died in the past 5 years, and the trillions more who would die if the war continued. "How certain are you that this will work?" he asked finally. Walsh consulted his data displays. "Based on the effectiveness we observed here, we estimate a 95% probability of success against any Devourer force. The nanomachines are specifically designed to target their unique cellular structure. They literally cannot survive exposure." "And the Council? How do you plan to convince them to authorize something like this?" Admiral Chun exchanged glances with her colleagues. "We're hoping you'll help us with that, Commander. Your reputation carries weight in the Council chambers. If you support our proposal." Zethvar realized that he was being asked to make a choice that would define not just his own legacy, but the future of galactic civilization. He could maintain his principles advocate for continued conventional warfare, and watch as the galaxy was slowly consumed. Or he could embrace humanity's solution and preserve civilization at the cost of his own moral certainty. Show me everything, he said finally. Every technical specification, every tactical projection, every ethical consideration. If I'm going to advocate for this, I need to understand exactly what we're unleashing. For the next 12 hours, Zethvar immersed himself in human military doctrine and philosophy. He studied their historical conflicts, analyzed their strategic thinking, and tried to understand how a species could develop such devastating capabilities while still maintaining some semblance of civilization. What he discovered was more disturbing than he had anticipated. Humans didn't just develop terrible weapons. They developed terrible weapons and then used them responsibly. They had created biological weapons and then banned them. They had developed chemical weapons and then established international treaties against their use. They had built nuclear arsenals capable of destroying their entire planet and then negotiated arms reduction treaties. You create monsters and then cage them, he said to Admiral Chun as they reviewed the historical records. That's one way to put it, she replied. We've learned that the capacity for terrible violence is sometimes necessary to prevent terrible violence. The nanomachines are horrifying, but the alternative is the end of all life in the galaxy. Colonel Rivera pulled up tactical projections showing potential deployment strategies. Commander, we've wargamed dozens of scenarios. With your help, we can coordinate a galaxy-wide operation that will eliminate the Devourer threat permanently. Without your help, we'll probably only manage to save a few systems before the Council intervenes. Zethvar studied the projections, recognizing the strategic brilliance behind them. The humans had planned not just for military victory, but for the political aftermath. They had considered how to minimize civilian casualties, how to prevent the nanomachines from being used against other species, and how to ensure that such weapons would never be deployed again once the war was over. You've thought of everything, he admitted. We've tried to, Admiral Chen said. Commander, humans have a saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. We've been preparing for this kind of war for our entire evolutionary history. We just never expected to fight it on behalf of the entire galaxy. Zethvar made his decision. Standing at attention, he formally saluted Admiral Chun in the human style. Admiral, I pledge my support to your operation. May the spirits of my ancestors forgive me for what I'm about to help you do. Admiral Chun returned the salute, her expression grave. Commander, if we're successful, historians will spend centuries debating whether we were heroes or villains. But at least there will be historians to debate it. As the human fleet prepared to return to the Galactic Council Station, Zethvar realized that he had witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare. Humanity had not just brought a solution to the Devourer crisis. They had brought a fundamental change in how the galaxy would think about conflict, survival, and the price of civilization. The question now was whether the other species would be willing to pay that price. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was unlike anything Zethvar had ever witnessed in his 40 years of military service. Representatives from over 300 species packed the vast chamber, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that the translation systems struggled to process. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension as Admiral Chun and her team prepared to present their proposal. Counselor Vrex, of the Altarians, was the first to speak, his crystalline form flickering with agitated patterns of light. Commander Zethvar, we have reviewed the preliminary reports from the Kepler system. Are you seriously asking this council to authorize the deployment of weapons that violate every treaty on civilized warfare? Zethvar stood at the podium, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine the fate of trillions of beings. Counselor Vrex, I am asking this council to authorize the deployment of weapons that will end this war and preserve civilization itself. The chamber erupted in a dozen different forms of outrage. The gaseous nebulons formed angry storm patterns in their containment fields. The insectoid HFY clicked their mandibles in rapid-fire disapproval. Even the normally stoic Zephyrians showed signs of agitation in their rigid postures. High Counselor Youthgura, the ancient Velnari who had led the council for over 2 centuries, raised one of her 12 arms for silence. Commander Zethvar, your reputation is beyond question, but what you are proposing goes against fundamental principles that have governed galactic civilization for millennia. How can you ask us to embrace genocide as a solution? Admiral Chun stepped forward, her small human frame dwarfed by the massive alien representatives around her. High Counselor, with respect, this is not genocide. Genocide is the systematic murder of a people. The Devourers are not people. They are a force of nature, like a plague or a natural disaster, and they must be stopped by any means necessary. Counselor Kethmore of the peaceful Aquilian Federation stood, his feathered crest raised in agitation. Admiral Chun, that same argument could be used to justify the destruction of any species deemed undesirable by those with sufficient power. If we cross this line now, where does it end? Colonel Rivera activated the holographic display, showing the progression of Devourer attacks over the past 5 years. Counselor Kethmore, it ends with the preservation of every species in this chamber. Look at these projections. At the current rate of expansion, the Devourers will reach the core worlds within 18 months. Your homeworld of Aquilia will be consumed in 14 months. The chamber fell silent as the tactical display showed the inexorable advance of the Devourer forces. World after world fell in the simulation, each consumed system represented by a fading light that disappeared from the galactic map. Chief Engineer Walsh stepped forward, his weathered human face grim. Counselors, we have identified every active Devourer force in the galaxy. 43 separate fleets, containing an estimated 12,000 individual ships. With conventional weapons, it would take the combined galactic fleet at least 10 years to defeat them, assuming we could achieve a favorable casualty ratio of 3-to-1. And how many worlds would be lost in those 10 years? High Counselor Youthgera asked quietly. All of them, Walsh replied simply. Every populated world in the galaxy would be consumed before we could achieve conventional victory. Zethvar stepped forward again, his 4 arms spread in the traditional Kytherian gesture of supplication. Counselors, I've spent my entire life fighting for honor, for principle, for the ideals that separate us from monsters. But I have also learned that sometimes the greatest honor lies in doing dishonorable things to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Counselor Vrex, then's crystalline form, flared with angry light. Commander, you speak of protection, but what you are proposing is the deployment of weapons that could destroy any biological species in the galaxy. How do we know that humans won't turn these nanomachines against us once the Devourers are gone? Admiral Chin's expression became hard as steel. Because, Counselor, humans understand the responsibility that comes with ultimate power. We've lived with weapons capable of destroying our own species for centuries, and we've never used them in anger. We've created protocols, safeguards, and international treaties to ensure that such weapons remain controlled. She activated a new display showing the nanomachine specifications. These weapons are specifically programmed to target Devourer cellular structure. They cannot be reprogrammed to target any other species without completely rebuilding them from scratch. Moreover, each deployment has a built-in termination sequence. The nanomachines will break down after 72 hours regardless of their target status. Counselor Zekthra of the militant Corvin Empire leaned forward, his massive reptilian form casting shadows across the chamber. And what guarantee do we have that humans will honor these limitations? Your species has a documented history of violence and aggression. Rivera's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. Counselor, our history of violence is exactly why you should trust us with these weapons. We know what they can do, and we know the price of using them. We fought wars that lasted decades, conflicts that consumed continents, and we've learned that there are some victories that aren't worth achieving. But this victory is worth achieving, Zethvar said, his voice carrying across the chamber. Counselors, I have seen the nanomachines in action. I have watched them completely eliminate a Devourer fleet in 6 hours. Not defeat them, not drive them away, eliminate them utterly. For the first time in 5 years, we have a weapon that can actually end this war. The debate continued for hours, with representatives from dozens of species arguing passionately for and against the human proposal. Some spoke of the moral implications of deployment. Others focused on the practical necessities of survival. A few questioned whether humans could be trusted with such devastating power. Finally, High Counselor Youthgara called for order. We will now vote on a human proposal. All in favor of authorizing the deployment of nanomachine weapons against Devourer forces. The voting process took nearly an hour as each species representative cast their decision. Some votes were unanimous within species councils. Others required extended debate. The humans waited patiently as their fate, and the fate of the galaxy, was decided by beings who had never faced the kind of existential threat that had shaped human evolution. When the final tally was announced, the chamber fell silent. 212 species had voted in favor of the proposal. 87 had voted against. The remainder had abstained. High Counselor Youthgara stood slowly, her ancient form showing every one of her centuries. By the authority vested in this council, we hereby authorize the deployment of human nanomachine weapons against Devourer forces throughout the galaxy. May the ancestors of all our species forgive us for what we are about to do. Admiral Chun bowed formally to the assembled council. Counselors, we will not forget the trust you have placed in us. Operation Pandora will commence immediately. As the session ended and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Zethvar found himself standing next to High Counselor Youthgara. The ancient Velnari looked at him with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. Commander, she said quietly, do you truly believe we have made the right choice? Zethvar looked through the chamber's vast viewport at the stars beyond, knowing that somewhere out there, Devourer forces continued their inexorable advance toward the heart of galactic civilization. High Counselor, he replied, I believe we have made the only choice that leaves us with a future worth living in. As the human delegation prepared to leave the station and coordinate the largest military operation in galactic history, Zethvar realized that the galaxy would never be the same. They had not just authorized a new weapon, they had authorized a new philosophy of warfare, one that prioritized survival over honor and results over principles. Whether that would ultimately save them or damn them remained to be seen. 3 months later, Zethvar stood in the same observation deck where he had first dismissed humanity as primitive. The view was different now. Instead of a handful of human vessels approaching the station, he could see the largest combined fleet in galactic history preparing for final operations. Ships from over 200 species worked in coordinated formations that would have been impossible before the war. But it was the empty spaces that told the real story. 43 star systems that had been marked as Devourer strongholds now showed green on the tactical displays. Operation Pandora had been more successful than even the humans had dared hope. In 97 days, they had eliminated every known Devourer force in the galaxy. Admiral Chun approached from behind, her footsteps lighter than they had been months ago. The strain of coordinating the largest military operation in history had taken its toll on all of them. Commander, she said, joining him at the viewport. The final sweep of the Andorian sector is complete. No Devourer signatures detected anywhere in the galaxy. Zethvar nodded, but his expression remained troubled. And the cost? Militarily? Minimal. We lost fewer than 300 ships across all 43 operations. The nanomachines performed exactly as designed. Admiral Chin paused, her voice becoming quieter. The real cost is harder to quantify. She was right, and Zethvar knew it. The galaxy had won the war, but the victory had come at the price of every principle that had governed civilized conflict for millennia. The footage from the various operations had leaked despite security protocols, and the sight of Devourer forces dying in apparent agony had shaken even the most militant species. The protests continue, Zethvar observed, gesturing toward the news feeds visible on nearby displays. Across dozens of worlds, beings demonstrated against the use of nanomachine weapons, calling them crimes against nature and violations of cosmic law. They have the right to protest, Admiral Chin said. In fact, I'm glad they're protesting. It means they still have moral standards that need to be reconciled with survival necessities. That's healthy. Chief Engineer Walsh emerged from the station's interior, his face bearing the exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 months perfecting instruments of destruction. Admiral, the weapon destruction protocols are ready to implement. All nanomachine production facilities have been identified, and the elimination charges are in place. Zethvar turned sharply. You're destroying the weapons? All of them, Colonel Rivera confirmed, joining the group. Every nanomachine stockpile, every production facility, every technical specification. By tomorrow, the weapons that won this war will no longer exist. But why? C'est var demanded. With weapons like these, the galaxy would be protected against any future threat. Admiral Chun smiled sadly. Commander, that's exactly why they have to be destroyed. Power like this corrupts. If these weapons continued to exist, eventually someone would find a reason to use them against other species. Maybe they'd start with dangerous species, then move on to undesirable ones, and finally, to inconvenient ones. Rivera pulled up historical data from human conflicts. Commander, after our Second World War, humanity possessed nuclear weapons capable of destroying our entire civilization. We came terrifyingly close to using them several times. Only through careful international cooperation and decades of arms control treaties did we manage to reduce the threat they posed. The nanomachines are worse than nuclear weapons, Walsh added grimly. They're invisible, unstoppable once deployed, and capable of targeting specific genetic markers. In the wrong hands, they could be used to commit genocide so precise that it would leave no trace. We can't allow that possibility to exist. Zethvar processed this information with growing amazement. You're willing to give up the ultimate weapon? To return to conventional military parity with other species? We're willing to preserve our humanity, Admiral Chun said simply. Commander, the moment we keep these weapons just in case, we stop being the people who deserve to survive and start becoming the people who need to be stopped. High Counselor Youth Guerra materialized beside them via holographic projection, her ancient form flickering slightly in the transmission. Admiral Chun, the Council has received your weapon destruction proposal. I must say, it has caused considerable debate. I imagine it has, Admiral Chun replied. Some species probably think we're fools for giving up such an advantage. And others think you're trying to hide evidence of war crimes, the High Counselor said bluntly. There are those who believe the weapon destruction is merely a cover for secretly maintaining stockpiles. Rivera stepped forward. High Counselor, we're prepared to have representatives from every Council species oversee the destruction process. We want complete transparency. We want everyone to know that these weapons no longer exist. Why? Youth Guerra asked. Why surrender such power? Admiral Chun looked out at the stars, her expression distant. Because we've learned something that I think the rest of the galaxy is just beginning to understand. The greatest threats to civilization don't come from outside enemies. They come from the measures we take to defend against outside enemies. She turned back to face the High Counselor's projection. We created the nanomachines to save the galaxy. But if we kept them, eventually they would be used to destroy the galaxy. Not by aliens, not by monsters, but by civilized beings who convinced themselves they had good reasons for genocide. Walsh activated the weapon destruction schedule. High Counselor, the process will begin in 6 hours. 47 production facilities across 12 systems will be simultaneously destroyed. All stockpiles will be eliminated using controlled antimatter charges. All technical data will be purged from every computer system in human space. And the knowledge? Youth Guerra asked. The scientists who created these weapons will spend the rest of their lives working to ensure that nothing like the nanomachines is ever created again, Admiral Chin said. We're establishing an early warning system that will monitor for any attempts to develop similar weapons. If anyone, including humans, tries to recreate this technology, the galaxy will know immediately. Zethvar watched as the weapon destruction countdown began on the station's displays. Around the galaxy, production facilities that had churned out instruments of extinction were preparing for their own destruction. It was unprecedented in military history, a victorious species voluntarily destroying the weapons that had given them ultimate power. Admiral, he said slowly, I owe you an apology. For what? When we first met, I thought humans were primitive. I believe you were too young a species to understand the complexities of galactic civilization. I was wrong. Admiral Chin shook her head. You weren't wrong, Commander. We are primitive. We're violent, aggressive, and capable of terrible things. But that's exactly why we understand the necessity of limiting our own power. Rivera brought up the final tactical displays showing the Devourer War's conclusion. Commander, in human military theory, there's a concept called total war, the idea that all resources and all methods should be used to achieve victory. We prove that concept works. But we also proved that surviving total war requires knowing when to stop. As the destruction countdown reached its final minutes, species representatives from across the galaxy watched via holographic projection. Zethvar realized he was witnessing a moment that would define galactic civilization for centuries to come. Not the moment when humanity had demonstrated ultimate power, but the moment when they had chosen to give it up. The final countdown reached 0, and across the galaxy, 47 facilities disappeared in precisely controlled antimatter explosions. In less than 10 minutes, the weapons that had ended the Devourer War ceased to exist. "It's done," Walsh reported quietly. High Counselor Youthgara's projection nodded solemnly. "Admiral Chun, I believe this may be the most important moment in galactic history. You have shown us that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to choose not to." As the human delegation prepared to return to Earth, Zethvar found himself fundamentally changed by his experience. He had learned that the most dangerous species in the galaxy might also be the most necessary, that sometimes salvation came from those willing to embrace damnation, and that the greatest victory of all was knowing when to stop fighting. Admiral Chun paused at the airlock to her ship. "Commander, what will you tell people about humans when they ask?" Zethvar considered the question carefully. "I'll tell them the truth, Admiral, that humanity is the most terrifying species in the galaxy, and that's exactly why we need you." As the human ships departed for their distant homeworld, Zethvar remained at the observation deck, watching until they disappeared into hyperspace. The war was over. The weapons were destroyed. Civilization had been saved. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the galaxy continued its ancient dance, protected by beings who had proven that the greatest weapon of all was the wisdom to know when not to use it.